Hey guys, Brandy again. So you guys made it through part 1. Good job. So hopefully now you have a better understanding of what React Native is and also Redux. So let's begin part 2.
So once again, if you don't have the bit.ly link from the previous video, please jot this down and go to it. You can also find it below. What that is going to do is it is going to bring us to this README, which is for this workshop. So there are requirements for this workshop. We have Homebrew, GitHub account, Git installed locally, and then the latest version of Xcode, which is very important. So if you haven't already, please install Homebrew by going to brew.sh. After you do that, we're going to install Node and Watchman. And then we are going to do a global install of the React Native CLI, which is npm install -g for global, then react-native-cli. Once we have that, you can make a folder in either your sites directory or it's on your desktop or wherever. And we are going to go ahead and clone down this repo. And we have that here in the getting started, so you can just copy and paste this into your terminal. Once you have that done, we are going to do a git checkout step-2. So once you have this branch checked out, run an npm install, and this is going to install all the packages for the entire project, and that may take a minute or so. Once that is done, we're going to run react-native run-ios. So I'll give you guys a few minutes to do that. And while you do that, I will go over our branching strategy that we have set up. So the one thing I noticed when following tutorials or doing any sort of online stuff is I always fall behind. And it takes me a while to actually get caught up because I'm so busy writing down the code. So at each step of the workshop, we have provided checkpoints, which are branches. And a branch is simply an independent snapshot of the code with the completed code. When you check out a branch, you will have everything you need for the next step of the workshop. And so here are the different steps that we'll be covering. So the first one is going to be routing. Then we're going to go into containers, components, and styles, followed by Redux, and then the different API integrations. So we'll go over step 2. And once we complete that, we're actually going to do a git stash, which is just going to stash all the changes you made. And then we're going to do a git checkout of the next step. And the reason why we're doing this is we're not having you write all the code for the entire application. What we want to do is just have you guys understand the basic concepts of React Native and Redux, and also integrating with the different APIs. So there's a lot of code for this application, and the stuff that we are having you write will simply just be to get the concepts down. And so then when you're done, you'll have a completed application with all the code that you can go back through and check out the different branches and see all the comments that are in there that will hopefully get you thinking in a way that will help you to build other applications in React Native. So the next thing that we are going to do is we are going to do the routing. So once again, if you haven't already, do a git checkout step-2, and then run that npm install, and then in your terminal do react-native run-ios. So let's take a look at the actual screens that we're going to be building today. So the first one is the welcome screen. You see we have a logo, we have a background image, it looks like there's an overlay over it, there's some text, and there's a button. And this button then takes you to the login, which there's a logo here, a background color, a text input, and another button. This login then will take you to categories. But you'll notice at the bottom there is GIFs and there is a profile tab. So it looks like we are setting up tabbing as well. And this is a scroll view, it looks like. It looks like we'll be able to scroll through the different categories. You'll probably remember that from the video. And then once we click on a category, we will be brought to the GIF selection where we can like or dislike the different GIFs that appear. And then from there, we can go to our profile where it has all the GIFs that we've liked. All right, so from here, let's actually jump into the code. Just as a reminder that my code will probably look a little bit different. I have the teaching steps, so mine just have a lot more comments in there to make sure I stay on track. So as you can see, we have our source folder. Inside of here, we have an assets folder, which has our images. Those are already in there just to save any hassle for you guys. Then we have a components folder with a navigation. And then we have our scenes. And those were the scenes that we just showed on the screen. So we have our welcome, our login, our categories, gift selection, and our profile. And then we have an app.js file. So the first thing we want to go into is our login scene. So the first thing we want to do is create the login scene component. So what we're doing here is we are saying class login scene extends component curly braces. What this is saying is we are extending the functionality of the already built-in component, which we are requiring in from React. Which you may ask yourself, well, why are we doing that since it's React Native? Well, React and React Native use some of the same components, and they share the same principles. So that is why we're using that. And then in here we have our render method, which we mentioned before will always be in our class components. And then we have a return parentheses, and then we have our view with a style set for styles.container. Inside of this view, we have a text which reads login scene, and then we have a button with an event handler called onPress, which we're passing in route actions, which we'll cover in just a moment. And this button is actually a third-party button that we're using because React Native doesn't actually have a built-in button component. So the next thing that you're going to want to write is the styles. We're not going to be covering styles in this section. We will in the next step. But these are just styles just to get you guys started so you can see it on the screen. So the next thing at the very end is we want to say export default login scene. The reason why we export it is because we want to use it somewhere else. And then if you're using a text editor like Atom or Sublime, you want to make sure that you save it. And you'll see up here we have all of our to-dos that we're supposed to be doing. So those are in there as well, so you guys can follow along, or if you want to come back to this, they'll be in there for you. So the next thing, let's just take a look at all the other scenes that we have. So we have our welcome, looks very similar. Same with the profile, same with gift selection, and also the category scene. They're just very basic scenes just to get you guys started with React Native. So the next thing we want to go into is our app.js file. So you'll notice up here that we're importing different things from a React Native router Flux. And we chose to use a third-party router because React Native navigation isn't fully, finished, I would say, and it's a little more complicated to understand. So we chose this one because it's pretty simple and very straightforward. So we're going to import all those scenes that we created, and then right here we're creating our actual routing. So we have our router, and then we have our different scenes inside of here. And remember what type of component this is? So this is our functional component because it's just simple. All it is doing is returning these views for us. So the very first one we have is our welcome. And you'll notice that these all have keys and other things that are similar. So there's three main things to keep in mind when using React Native Flux Router, is that they usually have three different prop types. The first one would be the key, which gives us access to this scene that we're trying to call. The next is component. So what do you want to be rendered when we call this scene? And thirdly is the title, which will appear at the top of your application. So we mentioned that we had a tab bar. So we have a key, which tab bar, which is what we're actually calling for this after we log in. Inside of there, we have a scene called GIFs. And inside of GIFs, we are actually rendering two views. So one of them is going to be the categories where we pick the different GIF categories. The second one is the actual GIF selection. And this is the part where you're liking and disliking the GIFs. The second tab bar we have is the profile. And inside of there, we have our profile scene where we're able to see the different GIFs that we liked. And lastly, we then want to export our application because we know we're going to want to use it somewhere else. So down here, we have these two files. We have index Android and then index iOS. In this tutorial, we'll just be doing the iOS portion. So let's go into that file and we are going to delete this. Then we are going to uncomment out our import. We're also going to delete the styles. Delete this. So what we're doing here is we're importing our app that we just created. And then we are calling app registry.register component, and we're passing app to that. So what we're saying here is this is where we want our application to be run from. So we want it to be run from our app file, which if we go back to, we'll notice that the very first thing that will be rendered would be our welcome scene. So now we can go over to our workshop application and hit refresh. So you'll notice we're right here in the welcome. So we should be able to hit the getting started and it brings us to our login. From the login, it should bring us to the category scene. You can see very minimal styles at this point. And then look, we have at the bottom our different tab views. So we have profile and GIFs. So far, so good. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is in our terminal, we want to do on git stash. And then I am going to do git checkout. And I'm doing the teach step, so I'm going to do teach step, but you're actually just going to want to do step -3. So give you a few moments to do that. So step 3 is going to be the container, components, and styles. So here are those commands again to run in your terminal. We're going to run git stash to get rid of all the changes that you just did, and then we're going to do git checkout step -3. So the first thing we'll talk about is containers, which are essentially just components, but we're calling them containers. And they are concerned with how the things work and the logic behind them. Our components are going to be worried with how the things look. A lot of times they're called presentation components. And then of course we have styles, which in order to make your app look nice, you're going to use styles. And I'll let you know that there's a lot of styles in here. We're not going to cover all of them, but you will have them so you can go through and look at them later on. And here is a cheat sheet that we created for you guys about Flexbox. Since React Native uses Flexbox for layout, this is a great thing to take a look at, and this will kind of give you an idea of what's happening in the current application. All right, so let's jump back into the code that we have. All right, so you'll notice we have a little bit more going on here. We have a components folder with more folders in it now. We have GIFs And we had navigation before, we have user. And now we have a containers folder, and then we have a styles. So the first thing we actually want to go into is this user folder. We want to go into the login form. So there's a lot to do here, it looks like. So the first thing we're supposed to do is create that login form again. So we're going to say class login form extends component. And we are going to have our render method with our return, and we are going to have our views in here. But let's back up one moment. So the other thing we want to set up is our constructor. And this constructor function, we're going to pass in props, and then we're going to call super inside of it where we pass in props. Inside of here is where we want to set the state of our username. And this may look familiar as the example that we went over in the previous video. So we're setting the state of the username to an empty text string. So let's go down here and take a look at what's happening. So we have our outermost view, which is our container, and inside of here we have nested views. And the reason why we have nested views inside of here is for layout purposes. So inside of this first one, we're going to use an image. And the source is just going to link us back to that assets folder with our logo. The next thing we have is a text input with our placeholder username, the style associated with that text input, and then we have an event handler called onChangeText with an arrow function where we're passing in text, and then we're going to call this.setState and set the username that the user enters as the username. From here we have our button with an event handler called onPress, where we're passing in this.handleSubmit, which we're using down here, which is just a component method. So handle submit, we're calling this.props on submit, and we're passing in the username that we have on state. Then up here, we need to bind this to handle submit. So we say this.handleSubmit equals this.handleSubmit.bind this. What we're doing here is we are giving handle submit access to props in state. The next thing we want to do is we want to say login form dot lowercase prop types equals curly braces, and this is where we're going to create an object. So for these components to work, we're saying that in order for this to render without an error, we need to pass on submit, which is the type of function on props, to this component. So we're able to use it in here, okay? So the next thing we can go over is a little bit of the styles. So we have the full container, which we're giving it a flex of 1, which we're just saying, hey, we want this to take up the entire space. And then we're saying justify content center. And then we're saying align item center. So how Flexbox works in React Native is there's a default direction. And in React Native, that default direction is a column, which means the default axis is the y-axis. So when we say justify content, we're actually justifying the content on the y-axis. The align items is for that cross-axis, which in this case, since we're not changing the default direction, it would be the x-axis. So these two things are making it completely center in the screen. Now, this may look a little different. We're saying background color to colors.black. Well, if you go over here into our styles folder, or even at the top, you notice we're importing colors from styles colors. So right here, all we're doing is creating a colors object. So we don't have to keep writing these hex codes out. So we can access them through colors right here. So I'm not going to go over all the other styles because they're pretty self-explanatory, but the one thing I will mention is these different flex numbers that I'm giving them. which I'll show you in just a moment after we finish what it looks like in the simulator. But so the larger the flex number, the more space you're wanting it to take up. And a great place to look is on the React Native documentation. On the left-hand side, if you go under width and height, you're able to play with the different width and height, which I can probably, if we go to the docs, show you. I believe it's height and width. Yep. So you can see it right here. And if you go down here, we have all these. We have 1, 2, and 3. So if I were to give this a 10, you can see that it gets bigger, or 20, or 30. See how that works? So if you want to play around with this, that'll give you a little bit of a better idea of what the flex values are doing. Okay, so it looks like we're almost done with this. The very last thing we need to do is we need to export out our login form we just created because we know we're going to want to use it. Make sure you save the login form. And then from here, we are going to want to go into our containers and go to our login container. So we want to import the login form that we just created. And we are going to want to go ahead and do class login container extends component curly braces. And we're going to want to set up the constructor again. So constructor pass in props. Then we're going to call super and pass in props. Inside our render function, we will have a view, and inside of that view, we're going to have a login form where we're passing an event handler called onSubmit. OnSubmit is then being set to a component method called handleSubmit. And all we're doing in handleSubmit is we are going to route it to the tab bar. You may notice that we're passing in username, but we're not using it. What we're going to do in the future, once we get Redux set up, we'll be passing the username to our action. We're just putting that in there for now, but we will be taking care of that in the following steps. So the next thing we want to do is we want to bind this to handleSubmit, which once again gives us access to prop and state inside our component method. And then we have our styles, which remember our containers aren't going to have a lot of styles. It's our presentation components that are going to handle all the styles. So that should be good for the login container. Once again, we have all the to-dos up here you guys are able to go over. So from here, let's take a look at what else we have. So here we have our category file. So our category is just that one row category that we saw. So the first thing says add touchable highlight. So touchable highlight is a built-in component with React Native. We're then going to pass in this event handler with an arrow function, and we're passing onSelect, or we're calling onSelect and then passing in the category. And you notice that we're passing category and onSelect on props to this category component. So inside of here, we're going to have an image, and then we're also going to have our text. So if you want to see more of how these styles work, I would definitely take a look at going over these ones in here. These ones have, an overlay and images and stuff like that. Once again, we have our prop types that we're passing in. So we're saying this category component needs category, which is a type of object, and it also needs onSelect, which is a function to be passed to it in order for this to be rendered without an error. So after this, we would then create the category list. So once again, we have our setup category list. We are going to create our constructor again. And inside of here, we are going to create that scroll view, which is a built-in component again with React Native. And inside of here, we're going to call this component method called getCategories. So let's take a look at what that's actually doing. So we have this method called getCategories, and we are passing categories and onSelect via props inside of here. And then we're returning this. So what we're doing is we are going to map over categories. And we are going to pass in the category and then an I as the counter, and we're going to return all the categories that we have, and we're going to pass the category and then the onSelect function to our category component. And you can notice down here that our categories is a type array, which allows us to map over it, which is simply just a loop. And then we have our onSelect, which is that function that we need. So once again, we have to bind this to our get category so we can access our categories and onSelect on props. Let's go ahead and save that. So the next, we want to go back into our categories container. So let's take a look at what we're doing. So we're importing that category list that we just created. So here's that category list. And look, we have the categories, which is a type of an array. See that? Where we have title and URL. And then we're also have the onSelect function, which calls this.handleSelection, which is right here. We are passing in category, which once again, we're actually not going to use until we get Redux set up. But then we're calling our route actions to route us to our GIFs. And then we're going to bind this again. So quickly, let's just kind of recap what we did. So we have this category list where we're passing in categories and then onSelect. Let's go to category list. So category list, we are calling this.get categories and we're passing in categories and onSelect right here. As we map over this array of categories, and we're going to pass the category and the onSelect to our category component, which is right here, and we're passing them in on props. This is how we're able to access category.url, category.title, because right here, look, we have title and URL. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense to you guys. So the next thing we want to go into is a GIF. So this is very kind of similar to the other one. We are passing in our GIF URL on props, and we want to use our image. And the source is going to be the GIF URL that we get on props. And we're saying that GIF URL is a type string. So our GIF list is once again going to be that scroll view that we have. And then in our getGIFs method, we are doing object.keys because it appears to be an object, which we're going to go over and then once again pass that URL into our GIF component. So the next thing we have is our selection carousel. So we are going to pass in our GIF on like and dislike on props. So we are requiring in that GIF component, and we're passing in gif.url. The next thing we need to create is our like and dislike buttons. So on our buttons, we have event handlers called onPress, which is an arrow function where we're calling the onDislike and the onLike, where we're passing in the GIF ID. And then we have the different styles for the buttons down here. You can take a look. And then once again, our prop types for this, we're saying the GIF, which is a type of object, then onLike and dislike, which is a type of function that needs to be passed to this component in order for it to be rendered without an error. So if we were to go into our selection category, we can go to see a little bit of what's happening. So right here in state, we're setting active to 1, and we're also setting these GIFs because right now we're hard coding these because we don't have our API set up. So right now we just have an object of all the GIFs, or of 5 GIFs. And then in this view to our selection carousel that we're calling, when we're passing GIF and onLike to it, and we're calling these functions. Right here, these two methods are simply just setting the state of the active one, which will just let you go through the different GIFs. So it's not actually liking or disliking them quite yet, because we haven't set up Redux or the APIs yet. And then I suppose we can take a look at our profile container, and our profile is simply just going to be a list of all the GIFs that we have. And then you can see our scenes are just going to be using our containers that we have. So right here, it looks like we need to import our login container, and we need to get rid of that. And we need to import our login container, and then we are going to delete all of this. Make sure you delete any trailing commas that will give you the screen of death, red screen of death. So you can see what we did there. Let's make sure we don't have any other ones to do. Here's our welcome scene again. So let's take a look if we did this correctly. So we are brought to our login screen. You see we have our image here, we have our text, and then we have our button, which brings us to our login, which I could type Brandy. And it brings us to our list of GIFs. So you can see these are actually GIFs behind here. The different categories you can pick from. You could go. So remember, these are all hard-coded, so these aren't actually pulling in the correct GIF right now, but this is where it brings you. So it looks like we did everything correct. So there was something that I wanted to show you guys quickly. If I can get back to it, which was the welcome screen. Okay, so something cool you guys can do if you have your thing on here, you hit Command D, which will bring up this sort of development tool, which is part of React Native. And something I like to do is when I'm styling stuff, I like to click on Show Inspector, which just lets you click on things. And it lets you see like how much room they're taking up and what properties they have attached to them. So this one has align itself to center. And if we click, not really what I wanted to do. So this one you see margin top 150 and flex of 2. So if I would have given this more flex, it would take up more room. But this is something you can take a look at or play around with. And then to get rid of it, you want to hit Command D again, and then hit Hide Inspector, because it does kind of get annoying. Okay, so we went ahead and did step 3, so let's run git stash again. And then I'm going to do git checkout teach step 4. So step number 4 is going to be Redux. We are going to run git stash first in the terminal to stash all your guys' changes, and then we will do git checkout step -4. So I came up with this analogy that I think is useful for me. I don't know if it'll be useful for you, but I figured why not share it. So we have our actions, and we have our reducers, and we have our store. Those are usually the 3 main things that people think of when they think of Redux. So actions I think of as like a coach for a team, like a basketball team, football team, dance team, anything. So a coach is there to give the players instructions on what to do. Then you have your players, which then take those instructions and do something with them, which would in this case be the reducers. So you have your coach, which gives all the instructions, and our actions, which handle all the data, the passing of data, and then our reducers or our players, which take those actions and then do something with it, and our reducers take the default state and return the new state. And then we have our store, which is also like team spirit and just sort of holds everything together, and sort of everything goes through that. So hopefully that's helpful. So let's jump into the code again. I'm going to exit out of all of these because it's just a lot. Okay. So once again, you'll see that we have another folder added, which is our actions folder. So go into our actions.js and you'll see we have all these constants created, which are simply just our actions that we're going to do. So in this first step, it says we need to create our login function. So we are saying export function login, and look, we're passing in that username, and then we're dispatching these other methods or actions. So this function is dependent upon these as well. So we're going to do login requested, login success, where we pass in the username, type login success, and then there's a payload. So what information are we sending? Well, we're going to send the username because that's what we're passing in. And just as a side note, this doesn't need to be called payload. This could be called whatever you want. But we did talk about how you structure your Redux, and most everybody calls this payload. So just to keep it, so if other people were to jump in, it's probably a good idea to call it payload, since it's a payload of information. So then you can see we're going to be dispatching those actions inside of our login. So if we scroll down, we have a few other things going on here. So we have this get likes. And inside of here, we have these temporary GIFs because we don't have our API hooked up yet. And then we are dispatching the get likes requested and then the get like success. And we're passing these GIFs to the success. We can keep scrolling down a little bit. And then we have this get GIFs. So this would be when we're talking to our Giphy API. And if you're not familiar with what the Giphy API is, if you go to giphy.com, you will see a bunch of GIFs that appear, and that's what we will be using. So right here, we are going to then dispatch the request and then the success. And then this data, which this is just mock data, that this would be the type of data that will be returned from the API. And how we know this is because we checked the API, and this is how the data looks when it's being returned. Then we have the set category with we're giving it the type set category, and we're going to pass the category to it. So those are our actions. So from here, we're going to want to go in and set up our reducers. So we'll go into our GIFs reducer. So you can see at the very top, we're importing all the different action types that we need. And then our GIFs reducer, we're going to pass in the default state of category, items, loading, and then an error. And then we're passing in our action. So this is where we're saying what to do. And we create a switch statement to go through the different types that we created. So the first one is the type of set category. And what we're doing is we're simply returning the state and then the category with it. So the next thing we have is our like requested and get GIFs requested. So since these are the same thing, they will be returning the same thing. So they're going to return the state, and then they're going to set is loading to true. And what you could do here is you could set up some sort of logic where maybe a spinner would load for the user to see, or some sort of user feedback so that they know something is actually happening and they're not just waiting for something, which I would highly recommend doing if you're building an actual production application. The next thing we have is get GIF success, where we're just going to return that state again. We are going to set is loading to false because it was a success, so the GIF should be loaded. But then we're returning the items where we're calling convert Giphy response, where we're going to pass in the GIFs that we received. So if we go down here, we see that we created this function called getGiffyResponse. We're passing in the GIFs, and what we're doing here is we're simply just formatting a new object. So when working with different APIs, you know that you kind of get a lot of data back and you probably don't need most of it. So we're saying that we just want the ID and the URL because those are the only things that we need. So then the next thing we have is the dislike and the like. And what we're saying here is as we're going through and liking and disliking the different GIFs, we're going to want to delete them so we don't see them again. And then we're going to return the state is loading as false, and then we're just creating a copy of the object and then returning the ones that we didn't like, or the ones that we haven't seen yet. And then here is where our error handling happens. So now let's go into our index.js. And this is where we create our root reducer, which we'll be using in the store. And we're using something called combined reducers, which is really just going to create our state tree for our application. So we're setting our user reducer to user and then our GIFs reducer to GIFs. And if we go into our store, which we showed you earlier, you'll see that we are passing in our root reducer, which is just that index file because it knows to look for the index right here. And we're using that thunk and that logger, which we'll show you guys in a little bit once we get our actions hooked up. Go ahead and make sure I save this. So the next thing we want to do is go into our different containers and make sure we have our actions. So at the very top, we're going to import the connect, bind action creators, and then all of our actions that we created. So if we go down here to the bottom, looks like we created this map dispatch to props. And we're just returning the actions, and we're calling this bind action creators. And what we're doing here is simply allowing us to use actions inside of this component. And it's going to automatically bind it or send it to dispatch, so we don't have to manually send it to the dispatch function on here. So it's binding all of our actions to the dispatch function. And then right here at the very bottom is we are calling our connect function, which is simply just connecting it to those actions for this component. So let's take a look to see if we have other ones. Yep, so here in the profile it says delete this.state object. Let's go ahead and delete that because remember we're setting everything in state with Redux. And then we're calling component will mount because we're wanting this to happen before the view is rendered. And we're going to call the action get likes because we're going to want to get what the person likes before we actually let them view it. So now we are setting this variable user GIFs, and what we're saying is if there's a user, return their GIFs or an empty object, which is what we're going to pass to the GIFs. And then down here, we're using the map state to props, which we're just passing in the store state, and we're returning the new state of the user. And then once again, we are going to bind those actions to this component so we can use them inside of here. And we are going to call our connect function as well. Make sure we save this component. And here is our GIF selection container, which we already have set up our actions, so I'm just going to kind of go over this one. For component, we're calling this lifecycle method called component will receive props. And all we're doing is we're saying that once we reach the end of a category, if all the GIFs have been liked or disliked, we're just going to reroute them back to the categories container. You can see we're doing the map state to props and then dispatching to props, and then we're calling the connect function on this as well. So it looks like in our categories container, we got to do some Redux stuff as well. So uncomment me here. So when we're handling the selection of the category, we're going to call two things. We're going to set the category where we pass in whichever category they're picking from, which could be kittens, fail, love, Star Wars, The Office, Trump, Scream Queens, or dance. From there, we are going to get the gifts, because once we set the category, we also need to get the gifts for that category. And once again, we are going to map dispatch to props, so we can, all of our actions can be sent to the dispatch function without us having to manually do that. So let's go ahead and make sure we have that saved. And I believe that should be everything for this. So if we go over here, we should be able to refresh, and nothing should have really changed. Oh, yep. So right here we got the red screen of death, and it says store is not defined in our app.js. So that is letting us know that we need to go here, and yep, it looks like I forgot to set up the store. So we're importing our store here, and then we're wrapping this entire router in the provider. What this is doing is this is giving our entire application access to the store state. That's all this is doing. Okay? So let's save that, and let's refresh. So cool, that looks like that worked. Let's get rid of this warning again. Let's go to get started. So that's just something cool I want to show you once we get there. So we have Star Wars. So this is what I wanted to show you. So this is that logger that we talked about, the middleware. So you notice we have these different action types. So you see we called set category, get gifts requested, get gift success. I click dislike, like requested, like success. So these are the different things, which is great for debugging because it shows you the different states. So we have gifts, which is an object, is loading as false. And it just kind of is very clear as to what's happening in your application. So now that this one is done, we are going to, once again, do git stash in the terminal. And we are going to do git step out step 5. So this is the Giphy API. So if you did not already, run git stash and then git checkout step dash 5. And we are going to go over how to integrate with Giphy. And this is an example of a GIF. So let's hop to it. So let me X out of these because it's very distracting for me. So let's go over, it looks like there was an API folder created, and we have our Giphy API.js. So what we're doing here is we are just creating this function called getGifs where we're going to pass in the category. And we're calling on this endpoint of the Giphy API where we're passing in the category title with our API key, and then we're setting a limit of 10. So how we know that we can do this is this takes some sort of search tag. It can be whatever that you want it to be, but when you go on your phone and you're sending somebody a GIF, like in your GIF keyboard, you type in muffin or kitten or fail, all the GIFs appear. Well, this is essentially, that's exactly what this is doing, but just in code. So where we use this is in our actions. So at the very top, we're importing our Giphy API, and then we are going to scroll down to the bottom. Remember where we had this right here? So we need to actually delete this response. And we're going to delete these because we're going to use it a little differently. And we are going to say, we're going to call the Giphy response, and we're going to call that function we created called getGiphyGifs, where we pass in the category, where we then are going to dispatch the success. And if not, we would then dispatch an error. And you notice that we do that when we're handling asynchronous actions. We use the error handling. So for this, this is all we had to do. So we can go back over to our application, go in to get started. Type in Brandy. So now, if I were to click on the office, looks like we get office gifts. This is my favorite TV show, so I had to put it on as a category. So I'd probably pretty much just like all of them. So now, if we go to profile, we're actually not going to see anything because we don't have our database set up, which we're using Firebase for. So let's go ahead and do that. So in your terminal, again, run git stash, and then we are going to check out step number 6. So git stash and then git checkout step -6. Okay. So let's take a look at the API for the Firebase. So right here, we're going to set our configurations. For Firebase, this is all the stuff you're going to need to interact with us. This one is currently set up for anybody following this workshop. Feel free to set up your own and do whatever you want with it. They have different levels depending on how much data you need and how many users and things like that. So the very first method that we're going to create is called the create user, where we're going to pass in that username. And what we're saying here is we want to set that username, and then we're going to add the likes that are associated with that. So this is simply just going to create that user model. The next thing we have is the get likes, where we're going to also pass in the username because the likes are attached to whichever user is liking them. And then we're calling this snapshot. And then we're going to return the snapshot.val. So what snapshot is essentially just the data that we get back from Firebase. That's what they call it. And by calling the .val function, it's just going to return it in a JavaScript object so we can use it. The next thing we have is the actual liking, where we're going to pass in the user and the GIF, because in order to like a GIF, we need to know what ID it is. And also who the user is that is liking it, so it gets saved to their profile. So if we go back into the actions, we are importing all from there. And then we are going to set up the Firebase API, where we're going to, in the login function, we are going to call the create user, where we're passing in the username, and then we are going to dispatch the success in here as well. And we also need to do that in here. So, sorry, there's a lot of comments in this one. I'm just going to uncomment this all out before I get confused. And here we go. Okay. So right here in this like function, we're going to return, where we're passing in dispatch, and we have get state, which is also something we have access to. And all we're doing is getting the state of the current user that is liking and disliking the different GIFs that we have. Inside of here, we're going to call that like function that we created, where we're passing it the username and the GIF. From there, we're going to dispatch the success of that. So we have that again here, where we're passing in the get state and we're getting the current state of the user. And we want to delete this object right here because we're not going to have just static GIFs anymore. We're going to have the ones that we actually like. So once again, this is going to call that get likes function that we created and pass in the username to get the likes from that user. So that should be it. So let's go over to our simulator, refresh it. All right, so once again, we have our getting started. This may have a couple different GIFs since I've been using the same username, so make sure you don't use something common that other people use. You can create any sort of username. Let me get rid of this again. So let's take a look at fail GIFs. Those are usually pretty funny. So, not really sure what that is. I don't really want to like that. Oh, it's a cat GIF. I'm definitely going to like that one. Okay. So we liked and disliked a few. Remember we set a limit of 10. So if we kept going through all 10 of these, it would then bring us back to the category scene. So okay. So there it looks like it's going to reroute us back there. Let's take a look at our profile now. This might take a while to get all those GIFs that we just saved. So there you go. There are all your GIFs that you just liked. So that is step number 6. And finally, step number 7 is the deployment of this application, which I would probably wait to deploy anything. Take a look at it, and you can definitely build on top of this. But here are the things to consider. The types of developer account that you want to set up, whether you want it to be a personal account or a business account. This really matters for how it is displayed on the App Store. So if you have a company name, that's what will be displayed instead of your own personal name. And then it's important to test your app on your phone without bundling it. And then it's also important to bundle the app and run it on your phone. So make sure you test it both ways. And then I would highly recommend using TestFlight for internal testing and also external testing for other people. You can easily set up a TestFlight account and get people like your friends or family to use it, or you can even push it out on other sites to have random strangers use it and get their feedback. Then the last thing that you actually need to do is do the screenshots for the release. Apple requires a certain amount of screenshots for the different shots of functionality that you have. And then finally, just go ahead and submit the release.
Made it through. Congratulations! Nice job. So that is the end of the React Native tutorial. Please leave comments or questions below. I would love suggestions for future tutorials or anything else you'd like to see. Thank you.